More choice can feel overwhelming to a big subset of drivers because this is not really their full-time job, right? And so when it's not your full-time job, you're on there to probably make a quick supplemental income. And so taking the time to browse through those boards and trying to understand what's the best use of my time is not worth their time because they're wanting to take something and use it, their spare time to then make extra income. We actually found that drivers, as you actually saw the driver become more of a full-time gig driver, they actually did prefer to actually find those jobs that fit their needs the best. But overall, the driver population does prefer those jobs that are given to them by the company instead of the ability to choose, which does seem counterintuitive. But when you think about why they're actually in this industry, it starts to make sense. So we actually started looking into this because there's a lot of research in the trucking industry talking about how drivers, more traditional drivers, actually non-financial incentives actually play a big deal in them not jumping from company to company. And so that was kind of the jumping off point for this research is as more companies start to use more non-traditional assets in their fleets, will we see the same type of behavior? Or since these are more part-time drivers, will we see them actually more incentivized by financial outcomes because they're just trying to maximize those? Because we still have the same problems about I want a steady fleet so that I can plan. And so that was the impetus for looking into this. And we did think that financial incentives would tend to be more important for these type of drivers. And what we found is while it is true, just like for most people, they do want to maximize their income, there are other things that do incentivize them to maybe take a little less pay because the convenience of that is a little better than alternatives. So I thought that it actually might be more important than financial incentives, and what we found, it actually aligned pretty well with what we had found with full-time drivers. I think the factors that are important are different in these type of drivers, but we do see that they do care about things other than just straight cash. So this was another thing, the issue of base pay versus promotions and how we present those to drivers was something that we knew we wanted to have a financial related variable in our research, but we wanted to be the way it was presented because we were looking at why do I choose to engage in one platform versus another. I have two, I can choose an Uber or Lyft, I'm making the exact same pay. What makes me choose one platform over another? Because there's this intermediate step between I tend to enter the gig economy, and then I choose a job. Between those two, I need to choose what app on my phone do I open up to work in. And so that was the decision we were looking in. And so we wanted to look at, okay, how do I get paid in those? Is it more I understand what I'm going to make before I get the job, or it's based on if I can maximize my time, I can make more money and things like that with bonuses, promotions, things like that. And I expected the promotions and bonuses to actually be a big factor in this because most of these are part-time. So the more they can maximize that outcome in a short amount of time, the more they're more likely to like a platform. But what we found, and you can actually look in the Wall Street Journal, and there's some recent articles that we were looking at around the time of our research, and they talked about the black box that were a lot of these gig platforms and their pay structures, and that and a lot of workers were actually tiring of that. And so I think what our research showed is that was actually true, is that when they did gravitate to more the clear pay, is they're willing to give up some of that ability to make it as fast as possible versus I know what I'm going to make when I jump into it. And I think that's a byproduct of a lot of how opaque a lot of these scales were for a lot of these companies over time. And the other thing that I think is counterintuitive for a lot of companies is when they do maximize that time with the bonuses, most of these workers actually have a pay that they're targeting before they actually enter the app. Mm-hmm. So the faster they actually reach that, the more likely they are actually to jump out of that platform for the day. So the more that they can plan about how much time they expect it. If they have a job that know it's $10 and they know what to expect, they're more likely then to account for that in the time they dedicate within the app too.
Sure.
Well, I think the opacity and the bonus structures, that wasn't the focus of our research, but a lot of the popular press talks about how a lot of essentially that these companies were trying to lower their labor cost. And so by making it opaque, they could lower that without the drivers getting loud and complaining as much. And I think in the short term, that probably worked, but then when they try to do that time and time again, it seems like a lot of these drivers just got tired of it. And so that's why are actually willing to give up a little bit of that and maybe that really quick income with the promotions and stuff, just so they know when they take a job what they're actually going to make. So, in supply chains, while we want a dependable supply pool, the goal in a supply chain is to match supply and demand. And that can be products, that's why we keep inventory, but it's also in our fleets and everything like that. And so we have the same goal with the fleet of gig drivers as we do of traditional drivers, right? We want to know how many products we need to move, and we need to know that we are going to have the supply to actually move that product from point A to point B. When you're hiring workers themselves and they're driving for you, it's much easier to plan for how many trucks or drivers I'm going to need because the drivers work for me. These gig drivers don't work for you. And so you don't know tomorrow if 10 gig drivers are going to log on or 100 gig drivers are going to hop on. So the more that we can make that dependable, that they choose to engage in our platform versus competitors' platforms, the more that we can then smooth out that supply of gig drivers. So we're not having to incentivize them by just having to up that pay just to get them to take the jobs, that we can actually better plan for how many gig drivers we're going to use in our fleet versus guess. And like I said, these learnings, I think, go outside the gig economy because what we're finding is that workers have choices. And where they choose to engage, whether a gig worker or other workers, turnover is expensive. And so while we are motivated by financial incentives, there are other things that make us feel valued and that align with our incentives too. And so the more that we could understand how different types of people, within the gig economy, there's different types of drivers. The way that you engage with a true part-time driver is probably going to look much different than if you engage with somebody that's using it more as their full-time job. And the way that you present jobs to them, the way that you present their pay to them, all makes a difference in how they leave your platform feeling like, it met what they were desiring out of that experience. And I think all workers are like that, right? The more that they feel valued in the experience of working, the more they're likely to leave each day thinking that, this was a good experience, and the less likely they are to then go start looking for jobs that better match those desires.